Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this CIGI discussion on vaccine shortages and growing trade tensions with Simon Evenett. Now, before I introduce Simon, a couple of housekeeping notes. This event will be recorded, and therefore it will also be available for viewing and sharing on the CIGI website, as we always do with our public events in a few days. And as we heard at the outset, we want this to be an interactive event when my colleague Bob Fay takes over the Q&A session. And so please feel free to send in your questions by using the Q&A function, which may be found at the bottom of your screen. And you can, in fact, send in your questions anytime during Simon's opening remarks, and we will get to as many of them as we can. There will be, or there is, a full biography of Simon that we will post in the chat function. So I will not go into all the detail, noteworthy as it might be, except to say that Simon, in my mind, is the quintessential applied economist, policy economist, indeed public intellectual, who has had careers both in academe, where he is currently at the University of St. Gallen, but also previously at Oxford and Rutgers universities, in the think tank world, in the international policy world at the World Bank, and much more. He is the founder of the Global Trade Alert, which I expect those of you who've tuned into this program would know well. A very diligent and useful exercise, highly credible exercise that tracks different forms of trade imperfections and impediments. Just a fabulous database and analytical capability to have, and Simon quarterbacks that one. And so thank you for that as well, Simon. That is also then, I guess, the platform for him to pronounce on very topical issues, and I can think of nothing more topical than the one we're dealing with today, which is vaccine shortages and growing trade concerns. But as I suspect Simon will delve into, there are issues around trade and vaccines that precede trade and vaccines, and there are postscripts to trade and vaccines. And so, as with any trade and agenda, there's the context and the environment, which matters so much as well. So who better than Simon Evenett to help us sort that all out, which is why, Simon, we're such big fans of what you do here at CIGI. So welcome back. You're no stranger here. And over to you.
Thank you, Rohinton, for those really generous opening remarks. And you're right, I've been to CIGI a number of times, and I look forward to going back to CIGI when we're all allowed to travel again. This is a great opportunity for me to share some thoughts with you about the risks to trade tensions being created by the vaccine shortages that arise at the moment. Now, before we get into the details, let's not lose sight of the big picture. International trade cooperation, in fact, cooperation in many areas of economic regulation, ultimately relies on a degree of trust between governments. And that trust is a very precious commodity, and it can be seriously eroded in times when essential items like vaccines are denied exports, and where governments take steps to essentially break existing commercial contracts and deny trading partners access to a vital resource. And so, although we will go through the domestic political economy, I'm sure, of vaccines, vaccine production, and also vaccine export decisions, policy decisions, please remember that there is a shadow here which will be cast over, I think, the longer term with respect to the ability of countries to trust one another. So maybe we could go to the first slide, please, and I'll lay out the contents of this presentation. So first, I'm going to put some facts on the table describing the different types of export curbs that governments have put in place with respect to COVID-19 vaccines and related materials. And I will also try and explain why these export curbs matter, because there's a real human side to this which should not be forgotten. And I'm going to do that making reference to some simulations that a colleague and I have run on India's export ban on COVID-19 vaccines and its implications for other developing countries. So these first 2 points are really going to help sort of situate this topic and hopefully reinforce its salience. Then I'm going to turn to why did the shortages arise and why have we seen the export curbs that we have seen up until now? Why have they taken the form that they have? So this will be the second part of my presentation, and you're going to see the central role that private incentives have played in giving us the current level of vaccine production capacity, and this also influences the ability to scale up production as well. Some of those private incentives are going to be influenced by public policy. There's a very clear public policy dimension which I will bring out when we try and diagnose how did we get to where we are today. Then when that diagnosis will then sort of have some suggestions or implications for policy, which I'll pick up towards the end of the presentation. But before that, I get to the end of the presentation, I want to also look forward just a little bit and highlight a feature which has not got that much attention yet. And that is that we will find very soon in the second half of this year, the United States will probably start building up a huge surplus of vaccines. And that surplus of vaccines could have implications for Canada as well. So that's the batting order for this particular presentation. Let's get going by putting the facts on the table and seeing the next slide, please. So the current state of play on export curbs on vaccines and vaccine ingredients is pretty much summarized by this table. We have 4 jurisdictions which have taken some type of action, but the action taken differs considerably. So the UK has an informal curb on exports of COVID-19 vaccines, and this is literally arises from the contracts that the government signed with vaccine producers, where essentially in return for financing of the development of the vaccines and building up the production capacity, companies committed to supply the home government first. So the UK has not been a big exporter of COVID-19 vaccines. There was a recent shipment to Australia, which was sent, but this seems to be more the exception than the rule. The European Union took a different approach and has put in place export authorization regimes, which at first sought to increase the transparency of shipments of goods and the production of vaccines, but then has been tightened up. And what has transpired is the following. Although the EU has only formally prevented one shipment from Italy to Australia, there's now growing evidence from the private sector that some vaccine producers have been told not to bother applying for export authorization because they will be denied it. And so essentially, one doesn't see any more refusals by the European Commission or member states to export because the companies know better than to apply for the authorizations in the first place. So this chilling effect is the current effect or consequence of the EU regime. The United States has an informal regime, not too different from the British, but one which relates to final vaccines and vaccine ingredients. And here the Defense Production Act has been used to designate US buyers as the priority buyers, which is the key term under that law. And this de facto has limited the degree of exporting. The US does have a formal export ban in the area of syringes and needles. So in that, and of course, these items are absolutely necessary in order to be able to get shots into people's arms. So they are definitely within scope in any comprehensive account of the export curbs in this sector. India doesn't have a formal ban on final vaccine exports, but we now have repeated statements by Indian officials that the domestic needs will be supplied first. And this is despite the Serum Institute for India committing to supply 1.1 billion doses to COVAX, much of which was going to be delivered to other developing countries. India has also put in place a formal export ban on one of the key medicines, which some people think is effective in dealing with COVID-19. So what we have then for each of these 4 producers of vaccines, final vaccines, different ways in which exports have been controlled or curbed, notice that when it comes to the final vaccine, not a single country has put in place a formal ban. Instead, we have a lot of informal measures or measures which are ambiguous in their application, like the export authorization regime of the EU. And I will return to that point. Now, these export curbs have caused considerable tensions between trading partners. We've all read about the tensions between the UK and the EU, which now seem to be getting back under control. There have been tensions between India and the United States. The EU has tried to take a low-profile way of trying to persuade the United States to export more vaccines and has been politely rebuffed. And so we're beginning to see that these measures are attracting responses from trading partners. And that is, of course, the source of the trade tensions, which is in the title of the talk. Perhaps we can go to the next slide to talk about the significance of these particular measures. Well, I'm going to just focus on one such measure because I'm interested in developing countries and their welfare. And of course, the country which had committed to export vaccines to other developing countries was India, in return for access to the AstraZeneca technology and in return for funding from COVAX and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. India committed to export, or rather the Serum Institute of India committed to export a lot of vaccines to developing countries. Well, as the left-hand chart shows, which shows the exports of India to the rest of the world of COVID-19 vaccines, these exports collapsed in the early part of March and have not recovered. And what I did with Matt Lineley from the consultancy Airfinity is to simulate how much this would delay the inoculation plans. Now, the great thing about working with Airfinity is they have fabulous data on the production and shipment schedules for vaccines. They probably have the best data in the business. And this and with that data, they're also able to use information on the rollout of vaccines to simulate when countries are likely to reach certain thresholds. Well, we had to pick a threshold for our simulations, and at the time India decided to stop exporting, the Indian rates of inoculation were around 4% of their population. So we asked the question, how many extra days would a ban on Indian exports require for other countries to take before they got to the 4% threshold as well? So if India was committing to export vaccines to Ethiopia and those shipments stopped, how much longer would it take for Ethiopia to reach that 4% threshold? And so what we found is that on average, inoculation in Africa would be set back about 3 months, even to reach that low 4% threshold level. And so this, of course, translates into additional misery, suffering, and economic harm, which, of course, should be a large development concern. There are similar results for Asia. Latin America is less effective because it was going to source less vaccine from India in the first place. But this gives you a sense about what's at stake here. And there's a human side to this that we must never forget. As well, so the trade tensions matter, but also the global public health side matters as well. So having set out why this is an important issue, let's turn to the vaccine shortages themselves and begin to understand what the vaccine supply chain looks like and what the patterns of trade are. So if we could turn to the next slide, that would be great, please. So on this slide here, which I've taken from a paper of Chad Bown with his colleague Bolioski, what we have is a picture of the supply chain, which essentially breaks the production of vaccines and distribution of vaccines down into 4 parts. First, the vaccine has to be developed, or originated is the term that some people use. Then it has to be manufactured in bulk. Then it has to be taken to a fill facility, fill and finish facility, which then, of course, produces the vaccines in the little bottles that you're used to seeing. And then the vaccine has to be distributed. And what we can have is blockages at each of these 4 stages. And this is very important because we'll come back to the discussion of intellectual property later. What matters if you want to get vaccines in people's arm is for every single step of this vaccine, of this supply chain to work. So anything that blocks the supply chain from working is going to stop our vaccines getting in arms. And so this is one of these complex situations where lots of things have to fall into place. Not just one thing, everything. And so that's an important feature to realize. Another important feature, which we show on the next slide, is that the production of vaccines, final vaccines, and the ingredients for vaccines are very highly concentrated. And so what we did in a paper with colleagues from the World Bank and from the European University Institute in Florence was to take the regulatory filings of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and the Pfizer vaccine, and to find out what were the key ingredients of those vaccines, and then to trace out the trade flows associated with those key ingredients. And it turns out that most of the ingredients for vaccines are shipped to vaccine producers, final vaccine producers. And so there is almost a club of countries which are both ingredients producers and vaccine producers, final vaccine producers. And this means then the world separates into two types of countries which are inside the club and outside the club. Clearly, being outside of the club puts you at some degree of mercy of the final vaccine producers. But the final vaccine producers have to worry about the ingredient providers. And so the final vaccine producers have a strong, you would think, disincentive to cut off any ingredient producer from exports. And of course, this threat works in both directions. Now, the significance of this, I think, is to help us understand why we haven't seen any formal export bans on COVID-19 vaccines. We've only seen informal, murkier forms of export control, which are a lot harder to pin and blame the other country for. And so I don't want to argue that there haven't been any recriminations. There most certainly have. But imagine what the recriminations would be if there had been formal export bans, which had been announced and defended publicly, how other countries would have reacted. So what we have is a very fragile truce between the members of the Vaccine Production Club, who take below the radar screen measures against each other if they act at all. And this, of course, leads to suspicion and the erosion of trust that I mentioned earlier. So we have this concentration of production in a small number of countries, and it's worth then thinking about why that is so. And that takes me to the next slide. So if we look on this slide here, we have to ask ourselves, why is there so little vaccine production capacity? Well, most of the vaccine production capacity in the world is available to produce vaccines which are given to children and where there is recurring demand. So think of all the vaccines you had as a kid. They had to be produced somewhere. And since we can be fairly confident there will be more kids tomorrow, then the revenue stream associated with these recurring vaccines, injections, supports a certain level of vaccine production capacity. That vaccine production capacity, of course, cannot be switched immediately to produce COVID-19 vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, which are new. But still, you begin to understand why we have the capacity we have. Now, digging a little deeper, it's worth asking, what's the business model for a vertically integrated vaccine producer? That's a vaccine producer that devises the vaccine, creates the vaccine, as well as manufacturing it. And let me take you through this business model, because I think it cruelly exposes why there is insufficient investment in this sector. The first thing is, if you're going to devise a vaccine, you have to put in a lot of R&D money up front, and you also have to build a production facility. This money, if it's not supported by any type of public investment, has to come from shareholders, and the shareholders are going to ask the question, what do I get in return for this upfront investment? Well, here the problems start. Vaccine R&D may come to nothing or to very little. We have had some companies invest in developing a COVID-19 vaccine and fail. And so this essentially is money which will not deliver a revenue stream, and of course, from a shareholder point of view, is lost. Even if a vaccine gets produced, then we have the revenue model associated with selling COVID-19 vaccines is different from that of a traditional vaccine. And that is, at the time when these investments were made last year, people were talking about there being a single or a dual jab treatment. And this, what we needed to do was to give every adult one such jab. which essentially defines the total market that there can be for jabs. And it means that once the market has been supplied, there is no further revenue stream. This, of course, has changed a little bit with the concerns about variants, so we can perhaps get into that in Q&A. But at the time these investments were contemplated, there was a limited revenue stream, at least in terms of time, maybe 2 or 3 years. Worse, there's always uncertainty about the intensity and duration of a pandemic. We've had prior pandemics where from a health point of view, the pandemic didn't turn out to be as bad as expected. But from a commercial point of view, for the firms who've signed contracts with governments expecting to supply vaccines, the governments have then cancelled those contracts, as is their right. But what that has meant is that there's been a revenue shortfall. Indeed, after we had the H1N1 pandemic, when a number of government contracts were cancelled in Europe early, the conclusion drawn by a number of pharmaceutical companies was that they had been burned. And so the revenue risks are not hypothetical, they're quite serious. On top of that, there are 2 other risks which I think are important and should be taken into account. That is that you can have supply chain disruption when vaccine ingredients either become scarce or there are export curbs. And so supply chain disruption can affect or disrupt downstream production of vaccines, and this risk has to be taken into account. And lastly, producing vaccines is not like following a recipe book, like the ones you have at home when you do cooking. You just follow the ingredients and go step by step. This is a complex process which requires adjustments along the way and requires serious technical expertise. So raising productivity up to the levels which generate the output, which generates the revenue to pay back for this investment, is itself a risky factor. And we have seen a number of the vaccine producers this time round run into problems in this regard. So in short, when you look at this business model from a business point of view, it's awful. It involves huge amounts of capital up front and very, very serious revenue risk. And without someone taking steps to de-risk this business model, it is no surprise that many companies have shied away from development of vaccines and vaccine production capacity. So the sad truth is we've got the vaccine production capacity that this flawed business model has delivered. And underlying this flawed business model are a number of features which I'm afraid are affected by political risk and uncertainty as well. So I think this helps you understand why we have so little production capacity and why it has tended to be concentrated in a certain number of locations where firms can essentially gain on economies of scale to try and overcome some of the risks which we see here. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, how do we begin to overcome these particular problems? What's the solution here? And the lessons from the last year have been very interesting. And so far, and the key word is so far, the US and the UK have been seen as successful cases. And they took essentially a venture capital approach to this. They looked along the entire supply chain. They understood they needed to de-risk investments by putting up substantial amounts of money. They knew that a number of the projects which they would be sponsoring would fail. So it was understood that not everything would come through in terms of developing a vaccine. But what mattered was developing a portfolio of which the expected number of vaccines would be sufficiently high to help tackle the pandemic. In addition, certainly on the UK side, the UK government requisitioned and repurposed factories for AstraZeneca. The UK government, like the American government, insisted on having domestic production capacity. So this is a very sort of aggressive form of nationalistic industrial policy. Ironically, from 2 governments who typically have eschewed industrial policies. And I think the interesting question is, and the policy question before people, is copying this model the right thing to do if you're a second or third mover? And of course, when you have these debates nowadays, some people say, well, we must copy the US and the UK. I'm not so sure for 2 reasons. First, we have a precedent case of Korea, which decided after the pandemics of about a decade ago that it would never, ever be short of vaccine production capacity. So Korea enacted legislation, spent a huge amount of money building up domestic vaccine production capacity and development capacity. Well, what was the result? This capacity was built, but this time around, when COVID happened, there's no Korean vaccine was developed. The Korean government was late to start vaccinating its population, and the Korean vaccine producers were late to sign contracts with the COVID vaccine developers who were successful. And so building a huge amount of vaccine capacity did not save Korea at all. It has not paid off. And this ought to make you cautious about assuming that just copying what the UK and the US have done this time around will guarantee results. The second observation to make is that we are entering a phase of production ramp up in the second half of the year, which will see more vaccines become available, but in particular, vaccines in the United States will be produced at a much greater rate. And that takes me on to the next slide. And this is looking forward, potentially some good news here, especially there's an interesting Canadian angle, which I'll come to. So the Americans at the moment are committed to offering a vaccine to every adult, and this requires 492 million doses of vaccine to be produced. The Americans will have produced that amount of vaccine by the 20th of June. That doesn't mean that they will be in American arms by the 20th of June. They've just been produced by the 20th of June. If the Americans do not change their vaccination strategy from that moment on, the surpluses will start building up. And so we will get to the stage by the 25th of September when the US has 500 million doses of surpluses. And the question then will be for the White House, what are you going to do with these surpluses? Are you going to hoard them or allow them to be exported? Well, the White House has other choices as well that it can make. It could expand the number of the vaccination to children. And we've seen recently that some of the vaccines have done quite well with children. And of course, if that happens in scenario 2, this pushes back the date that the American surpluses start building, but that will happen from the 19th of July onwards. Then the Americans could build reserves of differing sizes, and these are the scenarios 3A, 3B, and 3C, of varying degrees of ambition, having enough vaccines to inoculate an outbreak in America's 4 largest cities, having enough vaccines to inoculate the state of California, having enough vaccines to inoculate everyone over the age of 5. The bigger the reserve, of course, the later the date the Americans have surpluses for the rest of the world. But still, we get to various points later this year when the surpluses start building up. Even with the most aggressive surplus, the Americans end this year with a forecasted 461 million jabs. Now, by the way, I should tell you, these forecasts come again using affinity data and work that I did with Matt Linley very recently. Now, the Canadian twist to this is, as you know, the White House has shared, or lent rather, Canada some AstraZeneca vaccine, and they've also lent Mexico AstraZeneca vaccine. The White House has defended this choice on the grounds that the pandemic doesn't stop at borders; it will cross borders, and so it's smart for the American government to ensure that Canada and Mexico are inoculated as well. And so there's another scenario worth considering, and that is that after the Americans have inoculated their everyone over the age of 5, what happens if they then just decide to start sharing vaccines with Canada and Mexico? Well, they could do that, and the Americans' production capacity would, by the 16th of September, have enough vaccines to inoculate not just the American population, but the Canadian population and the entire Mexican population as well. And so what you have south of the border is a huge production ramp up, which is, if it carries on, may mean that there could be a lot of vaccines available in the second half of this year. And that may mean if Canada decided to produce a lot of vaccine production capacity now, that production capacity, which takes time to build, may come in after shipments from the United States start arriving, which again makes you think twice about going for an aggressive industrial policy solution. So these practical considerations, I think, are worth bearing in mind as well. And as you know, there's a hint here of a source of optimism, but also a very, very big set of questions for the Biden administration about what they're going to do with these vaccines. So will this become an issue where the Biden administration demonstrates its virtue and its cosmopolitan intent, or does it demonstrate that it too will deal with America first and not share vaccines with the rest of the world? Let me draw my presentation to a close before we turn to Q&A. Let's go to the last slide, please. And here are the policy implications which I'd like to talk about. The current shortages of vaccine can be met with a significant expansion of supply. But ramping up that supply is going to require addressing head-on the weak business case for doing so. And what we have is a strong need to de-risk these investments. And one of the principal sources of risk here is political risk or policy-based risk of trade policy like export controls, disrupting supply chains, risks that procurement policies will be abruptly changed as well, risks that regulatory standards will be changed, or as we've learned in Europe, risks that governments and medical regulators flip-flop on their assessments about the efficacy of vaccines. All of these risks are things which could be de-risked or reduced. We are paying the price for an antagonistic relationship between some government, civil society, and the pharma companies. This clearly hasn't helped, and I suspect the pharma companies have been unable to explain the predicament that they find themselves in, especially with respect to their business models. And one doesn't get the sense that every government is willing to listen either. And so this poisonous relationship from the past has not helped as well. One item I haven't talked much about, and I'm sure we'll talk more about in the Q&A, is the importance or the unimportance of intellectual property, codified intellectual property. Now, let's be clear, I'm a trade policy analyst. I am not a professor of vaccine production. So what I have done is to try and find as many independent vaccine production experts who have opined on this issue. And I'm talking about independent experts who do not work for pharma companies. And I know of no vaccine production expert who believes that the sharing of codified intellectual property is the bottleneck. What has been identified much more often is the tacit knowledge necessary to take that intellectual property and to productively translate it into manufactured vaccine. And what we're seeing, and this is perhaps the most depressing feature of this situation, is that the firms that have the intellectual property to produce these vaccines have so little talent internally to be able to share or be able to help third parties ramp up their production. And I think the experience of AstraZeneca in this regard and its contract manufacturers really reinforces the point. And I can give other examples in the Q&A if necessary. In terms of solutions, it is very hard to deny that the US and the UK took aggressive state intervention to get them where they are in terms of vaccine production. But just because it worked well for the Americans and the British doesn't mean it works well for everyone, as Korea's experience shows. And furthermore, if indeed we have the ramp up of production, which the forecast, the consultants who really know this industry are looking at, if anything like that ramping up of production happens, then we will have a case where Canada's southern neighbor will have a lot of vaccines, surplus vaccines on its hands. And the question then will be whether that neighbor decides that its neighbors need to be vaccinated quickly too, in order to ensure that North America comes out of this pandemic as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, Simon, thank you so much for that sort of exposition of a number of things, and I know we will pick up on them. I thought that the exposition on the vaccine development and production chain, indeed ecosystem, helps us understand some of the pharma behavior. On the other hand, the long-standing question of where do they deploy their monopoly rents? Is it truly to avert risk, or is it to maintain those monopoly rents via advertising and lobbying is an issue, and I think seeps into your question about the sort of troubled relationship between different groups and the pharmaceutical industry. I thought the points on industrial policy, Simon, were very strong. I mean, I've never believed that the UK and US have eschewed industrial policy, maybe in rhetoric, But you just gave an example of why don't actually apply your rhetoric is my sort of lesson from that. And I also thought that in your penultimate slide, you reminded us that vaccine diplomacy, and indeed in some ways the geoeconomics and geopolitics of vaccines, is not limited to China, India, and Russia, but that once you're a vaccine producer, given the environment, you are in the vaccine diplomacy game. So that and many others of important lessons to tease out with my colleague, Bob Fay. Again, Bob's full bio is in your chat function. I will say that Bob has spent over 2 decades working at the OECD and the Bank of Canada before joining CIGI 3 years ago to head our global economics and digital economy work. Always a pleasure to have him on board to deal with the Simons of the world. And so, Bob, this one's all yours.
That sounds like quite a challenge. Thanks a lot, Rohinton, for those remarks, and to Simon for like an amazing, thought-provoking presentation that I think challenges some of the things that Canada is doing right now as we deal with the pandemic. So I'm going to begin this session with some questions for Simon. And then I'll turn to the Q&A from the audience, and we're gathering your questions as we sit here. So please continue to funnel them in, and I will then turn to them. So Simon, I thought we may as well just start with one of the issues that you left at the end, and that's TRIPS. And I think for the audience, it's possible that some may not know what TRIPS is and why it's important. So perhaps maybe we could just start with TRIPS, and then we'll get into the specific issue related to vaccines.
So TRIPS is the acronym given to the agreement at the World Trade Organization, which was signed in the middle of the 90s. This agreement relates to the protection of intellectual property in lots of different forms. This agreement also has provisions in it which allow countries to compulsorily license intellectual property in times of emergencies. And the issue which you raise is there's a proposal from India and from South Africa that elements of that agreement be suspended, so the argument goes, so as to encourage the transfer of the vaccine IP to other producers, with the goal, of course, of ramping up production quickly so as to be able to beat this pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a debate that's taking place in Canada right now, and you're very well aware of this because you presented last week to the Standing Committee on International Trade in our House of Commons, where this was one of the subjects of discussion. And this Friday, our president at CIGI, Rohinton, will also testify before this committee. And as you saw in the committee, there's a wide range of issues on this. And I think there are issues that do need to be addressed. So, and you touched upon some of the issues as to why a waiver may not work. On the other hand, there are some eminent individuals out there who clearly disagree. Former leaders and Nobel laureates, and I think maybe it would help to tease out the different dimensions so that people can understand why some people are arguing for the waiver and some people, such as yourself, say that really isn't the heart of the issue.
So let me try and do that. So last Friday, when I had this the privilege to testify to the Canadian House of Commons, the strongest argument which was made by one of the MPs was, I can't see how waiving intellectual property and waiving the TRIPS agreement can hurt. So it was interesting. It was very carefully framed, not that this will fix the problem, but this won't hurt. That was how it was put. When you read the letter that you referred to, which is signed by a number of heads of government, former heads of government, and a number of Nobel Prize winners, it's very carefully written. It calls for the TRIPS waiver and supports India and South Africa, but it highlights that this will only work if it's part of other policies to share, or other practices to share the tacit knowledge needed to translate that IP into into vaccine production. And this is where the core of the matter comes in, because it is pretty evident that the IP producer, the vaccine producers, do not have much capacity to be able to help other firms scale up. So here is an extraordinary example, which was reported in Monday's Financial Times. The Prime Minister of Italy had approached Moderna, which is a producer of the mRNA vaccine, and said, why don't you build a factory in Italy? And the Moderna CEO was empathized. He understood why Mr. Draghi wanted this. But the point he made was, or is reported to have made, was that Moderna just has enough technical talent to make its mRNA vaccines work in their own factories, not in any others. So we have, the fundamental shortage here is that we have very few experts capable of producing these vaccines at scale. And if you think about it, the mRNA vaccines, this is the first time that they have been taken from the drawing board into mass production. And so there aren't football teams of experts who know how to do this. There are a small number of people, and this message comes consistently from independent analysts, which is that we don't have the people to be able to translate this intellectual property into production. And this fundamentally is why I don't think the TRIPS waiver will work. The bottleneck is a lack of talent. And so if you want to think about, okay, how do we help try and fix this? We need to get the vaccine producers who have produced these novel vaccines and the like. We need to find out what would it take to be able to train up other people who can help then raise the productivity of vaccines produced in plants which have received the IP, but don't necessarily receive much technical support from the other companies. So we need to fix that problem. And that's why I see this as the ultimate bottleneck is quite frankly a lack of talent. That's the consistent message you get.
Yeah, and fair enough. I mean, there are different dimensions, and one of the dimensions that is pointed out, and goes to your point about the risk that's undertaken by pharma companies, among others, when they undertake these really large sunk costs that are very risky, and it's not clear whether it's going to pay off. In this particular case, something that Rohinton's part of, this Commission on Global Economic Transformation, pointed out that, at least with this vaccine, and I think you mentioned it too, there was a very, very heavy public subsidization of the R&D efforts behind the vaccine. And from my perspective, as well, there should be, because they're creating a public good for a pandemic. I mean, if there isn't a case for heavy subsidization here, I don't know when there would be. But it does, to follow up on your question, or sorry, in your answer, the supply chains and how well they have stood up in this. And, I think I was saying to you before we started, I read an article, I think Moderna or Pfizer, one of those vaccines, there's at least a couple of hundred components in that supply chain. Like, it's incredibly complex, as you said, requires a lot of talent to utilize it. But, in your analysis of the pandemic and trade, did any clear supply chain frictions or barriers come up that you think just shouldn't have been there, that should have been easily addressed? Or are there ones that are more fundamental that we really need to address as we get out of the pandemic?
Okay, so when we're thinking about the vaccine ingredients, which is what you're homing in on, Bob, it's true there may be 200 ingredients in some of these vaccines, but not all of them are critical. So some of them are sodium chloride, which we commonly call salt, right? So there's, well, again, it may be refined levels of salt, but still, not all of them are critical. Some of them are reputed to be very important, right? So in the case of the mRNA vaccines, the lipid nanoparticles are said to be important. And then one of the few producers in the world is actually in Canada. Another one prominent one is not far from where I live here in Austria. So what we have there are some ingredients which are much more important than others. Up until now, we have had press reports, at least in the initial scaling up in Q1, of some of the vaccine producers in Europe having difficulties getting the necessary levels of supply. Looking forward, where there is a risk is, as I mentioned earlier, the production expansion, certainly south of the border from you, and in the UK and possibly in Europe, this expansion over time is going to be so large that it may well put some of the ingredient producers under strain. Mm-hmm. And one would hope that forward-looking governments have gone through the different scenarios in this respect, and then tried to figure out how to invest in the ingredient production business so as to be able to alleviate some of these shortages. And my last comment on this is, if you listen to the CEO of the Serum Institute of India, he has been complaining that shipments of key vaccine ingredients from the United States have not happened. And if that is the case, then this is quite regrettable as well. But what we can see is that there are potential here for supply chain disruption. There may well have been supply problems in the first quarter, at least if you believe the producers in Europe, and they may well recur as we go forward in the year. And of course, this the part of the solution to this particular problem is to take seriously this whole of supply chain approach and to look for every single major bottleneck in the key ingredients that exist.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I had, that I've been puzzling over is, whether, obviously there's a supply chain associated with the production of these vaccines, which clearly is ramped up, created pressures, which are not surprising, versus the underlying other geopolitical issues at play. So, for example, we know that trade restrictions have been rising more or less continually for almost a decade now in many different areas. There are policies in place that, such as Buy America, like that, that are creating other tensions around supply chains. And I just want to get your sense and your view on the relative balance between those two.
Maybe I can react to this in the following way, which is that, we've seen such a build-up of protectionism in the last 10 years, especially below the radar screen type protectionism, not the 1930s style, the much more opaque forms. And you mentioned Buy America provisions and the like. So we have a lot of sand which has been building up and impeding international trade, and also creating tensions between countries. This has eroded trust. And then to have a pandemic come afterwards, where, quite frankly, in order to tackle that pandemic, we do need governments to take a far-sighted view and not to impede supply chains for vaccine ingredients, PPE, and other things. So to have a pandemic which, quite frankly, requires trust between governments after a period of massive distrust is nothing short of really bad timing. And I think one of the lessons I take from this is that every time a government decides to sort of engage in murkier forms of protectionism, if other countries emulate this, we end up in a situation of growing mistrust. And when we do have a crisis hit, there isn't much goodwill to draw upon, and you end up with some of the rather nasty and fractious debates that or debates and recriminations that we've seen over the past 12 months.
Yeah, trust is a word that comes up often, especially in the work we're doing on the digital economy, where trust is essential for things like data flows. I want to go back to another point you raised about vaccine production. And, for a country like Canada, it might appear to be just too late to get in the game, especially with all the supply that's ramping up in the United States. But I guess against that, the one thing that the pandemic has shown is if you don't have vaccine production, one, you're going to have terrible human losses, and you're going to have, on top of that, the economic losses of not being able to get back to normal more quickly. Do you think that's a reason for countries to continue to try and develop their own vaccine capacity, or is it hopefully the trust will be rebuilt and then we can rely on our neighbors to help us out?
Here's a way of thinking about this, which is, and it goes back to the business model which I talked about. Maybe one approach going forward is that we separate out the first two stages of the vaccine production chain. That is the development of vaccines from the contract manufacturing of vaccines. At the moment, we've bundled together those two stages because many vaccine producers are vertically integrated, and we've rewarded the people who come up with vaccines with juicy contracts for when they produce vaccines. Maybe what we should be doing going forward is to have very generous rewards when we have pandemics and very generous prizes or financial bounties paid to firms that develop safe vaccines with a high level of efficacy, and where they do so in a way where they have also nurtured the human talent to then share those insights with the contract manufacturers. And then separately, what we might want to do is to think about whether we want to encourage vaccine producers to maintain a certain level of excess capacity, which can then be, that excess capacity can be repurposed when a pandemic happens and used to produce whatever vaccines have come out from the discovery phase. So maybe we should separate out the vaccine, the incentives for vaccine discovery from the incentives for contract manufacturing. And from the incentives of contract manufacturing, we have a sector where many countries pay for excess capacity to be maintained, and that's the electricity sector. So we have we have good analyses about the pros and cons of doing that, and it is a messy area, but there are different competing models for maintaining excess capacity, which seeks to reduce the distortion to market forces, to international trade, and doesn't cost too much for the public purse. So maybe I think going forward, one solution might be to support vaccine races for the development of new vaccines. And what matters is that they're developed somewhere in the world. And if there is a case for retaining some production capacity at home, then we have a sophisticated system of paying for excess capacity to be preserved. And again, as I said, there's precedent there we can learn from the electricity sector. And this might be a way of providing more confidence next time round. I should add, however, that since we don't know what the next pandemic will be, we don't know what the next vaccines will be, and if there's a dramatic change in the technology necessary to produce vaccines, there's always a risk that the installed production capacity for vaccines can't be repurposed quickly. So again, the solution I've described is one which is imperfect, but it might be better than what we've done up until now.
Yeah, and of course, also related to the points that you talked about earlier, that you also need those complementary investments and skills and things like that. One of the questions that I've received goes back to the waiver, and the question is, wouldn't the waiver go some distance in building trust with the developing country governments that tell us they need it?
Right, but okay, so that's a very interesting question, because not every developing country does say they need it,
mm-hmm.
which begs the question why some of them are asking for it in the first place. So let's just reflect on this a bit. The last time we had a big fight about TRIPS waivers was in the context of AIDS drugs. And Brazil was very prominent in demanding the flexibilities be applied under the TRIPS agreement. This time around, Brazil has been silent. They have not joined South Africa and in India. And if anything, they've signaled the opposite. Now, Brazil has a substantial generic drug producing capacity, as does India. So Brazil and India have very similar export interests in this regard, but they've taken a very different position in this debate, which makes me wonder. It makes me wonder why Brazil has chosen to assess this situation differently.
Well,
Brazil has a very serious outbreak of COVID.
But
So
maybe
does India.
it's, we know that that Brazil leadership in Brazil has a very different view on whether this is, on
No, I agree. I
COVID
mean,
itself. Yeah.
that's
So
I was going to say that's a fair point. That's a fair point.
yeah, but turning to another, we've got a couple of questions about India, and so staying on the developing country line of questioning, and the question is: did the Serum Institute receive advance money, and if so, to produce the vaccine for COVAX, and if so, are they in breach of contract? And I suppose maybe a related question is, maybe do we put too many eggs in one basket with the Serum Institute?
So the answer to the second question is almost certainly yes. The answer to the first question is I haven't seen the contract between the Serum Institute and COVAX, and so I can't really comment on that. If it's the classic best endeavors contract, then the Serum Institute can say we did the best we could, but the Indian government wouldn't let us export. So again, I think on that contractual matter, so much depends on the terms which I haven't had sight of.
And a question from a political science student who asks, were you surprised by the depth, I'll read directly, the depth and malignancy of the political miscoordinations globally that have hampered the overall pandemic response?
The answer, sadly, is no. I was not surprised, and Rohinton partly gave you the answer because he pointed out that for the last 12 years, we have been tracking what governments have been doing under the radar screen in trade, and this has not been an era of much good practice or better practice. And so, I'm unfortunately, what we've seen now is a continuation of the type of trade nationalism which has been building up for some time.
Well, and unfortunately, I'm in the same boat as you because in my former job, we use your data to track trade restrictions, and it's a pretty sad sight to see just the rise over the last decade. Unfortunately, I know we could go on for another hour at least, and I know I personally could go on for another hour at least. But it's late for Simon, and I really would like to thank you very, very much for your presentation. It's an extremely important and very topical issue right here at home, and I know we've all benefited greatly from your analysis and your presentation. I would like to encourage everyone to go to Simon's the Global Trade Alert website, where there is this wealth of information that many policymakers are using globally. It's very well presented. It's very easy to access and to understand. So it's truly a global public good what he does with this work. So thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Oh, and just one other plug. So Simon also just started doing work documenting policy changes that affect cross-border digital commerce, an area really important to us at CIGI. It's a really important emerging area. It'll feature into things like the e-commerce negotiations going on at the WTO. So once again, thank you for that. And just a few housekeeping remarks here. All the video and everything, and the publications that you saw flash across your screen are available or will be available on our website. On May 18th at 1:30, we will have another event with Shelley Bruce, who is chief of the Communications Security Establishment, who will discuss the importance of deterring malicious cyber operations and technologically enabled risks to Canada's national security. So that will be extremely interesting event. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to share this event or with your colleagues, it'll all be posted on our YouTube channel shortly. And please subscribe to CIGI Online on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn to keep up to date on the work we're doing at CIGI. Once again, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Simon, and have a great day, everyone, or a great evening.